Okay.
Yep. It's
Okay.
recording.
All right, perfect. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. I am very happy with the guests we have on. We have two contributors to the World Socialist website, two members of the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand. This time around, we're going to be doing a lot of truth-telling and myth-busting on all things New Zealand. It's a country I've been wanting to cover for a long time, and I love the World Socialist website, and we are joined by Thomas Peters and John Braddock. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining me on 1+1.
It's a pleasure.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Perfect. And in case anyone wants my opinion on last week's, if you want to even call that a debate, between Pumpkinhead and sleepy, creepy, sleazy Joe Biden, my only response to that, because we're not going to be talking about that, is heaven help us all, and we're on the road to nowhere. And before we get into New Zealand politics, what was both of your responses to it?
Well, I think it's appropriate to start with US politics, really, because that is, I guess, the center of the world crisis. You know, the worst hit country by the pandemic. And
no,
or one of the worst.
No, we don't have to talk about it, but any brief responses you guys had to these two arch imperialists and arch racists duking it out, so to speak, or.
Well, hopefully you may have seen our coverage on the World Socialist website. I mean, it's certainly an extraordinary time in American politics. I mean, Trump openly threatens a coup d'état, says his fascist goons have to stand by for violence on polling day, and the response of Joe Biden in that debate was, well, the problem is that the president is just trying to rile everyone up and he needs to calm everything down. And then the solution the Democrats have is, well, everyone needs to vote and your vote will be counted, which, I mean, Trump is threatening to totally disregard the election result. And so the other response of the Democrats is that they are appealing to the military to step in.
To the deep state, Trump, actually, yeah.
Yeah, and so the one thing that they are both terrified of, and you can see that now with Trump having caught COVID-19, the Democrats all basically hoping and praying for him to get better, because the one thing that both sides are afraid of is the independent action of the working class. There is such an explosive situation in America that is revolutionary, really, and the missing ingredient is a socialist party and a perspective to guide these ongoing mass protests in the US, and the Democrats are just desperate to prevent a conscious socialist movement from emerging. And you can see that now because they are terrified of what Trump's illness could trigger in the population. So, yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, John.
Yeah. Well, just perhaps if I could lead into New Zealand, because it's a
before we get into New Zealand, let's just already get into New Zealand politics. I will just say one thing. I'll just say one thing. Anyone who is an American voter who actually watches 1+1 and may share it amongst friends and all of that, you cannot vote for Joe Biden. You cannot, if any decent human being, any decent person that calls themselves a socialist, a revolutionary socialist, or this stupid empty term progressive, or even a left populist cannot vote for sleepy, creepy, sleazy, war profiteering Joe Biden. And you cannot just abstain in the face of Trump, which I think, since I like the World Socialist website, and if you are a Tulsi Gabbard supporter or even a Bernie Sanders supporter, you need to vote for the Socialist Equality Party, or you need to vote for a party for socialism and liberation. And although I'm not that impressed with Howie Hawkins, but yes, those three parties, I personally, if I could vote, I would vote for the SEP or a party for socialism and liberation. And I think
we do have a presidential candidate and vice presidential candidate.
Exactly.
Standing, of course, and we would encourage people to vote for those. It's the details are on our website. So Joe Kishore is our presidential candidate, and we have plenty of material with our policies and so on. So yeah, we'd encourage people to check that out.
All righty, and okay, all right. So let's get started on all things New Zealand. Okay.
Well, what I was going to say was that in fact the US presidential election poses quite an amazing situation, because New Zealand, of course, is heading towards an election in 2 weeks' time, or less than the 17th, and the establishment parties have got nothing to say about foreign policy in particular. In a debate a few nights ago, both the leader of the Labour Party, the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, and the leader of the opposition, Collins, were asked about
I saw those debates as well.
Yeah.
Both of them. Both the debates and the multi-party ones too.
Yeah, were asked about their attitude towards Trump, and Jacinda Ardern said, well, basically, we will work with whoever's in office in Washington. There's nothing you can do about that. Collins went even further and praised Trump's Middle Eastern policy, claiming that it would bring peace to the world, completely falsely. So here you have the two, sort of main leaders of New Zealand politics throwing in their lot with
the two main rival oligarchic parties, I must say.
That's right, throwing in their lot with Washington. Now, that's very significant at this point, because it's not as if Washington doesn't know what's going on in New Zealand. In fact, they play very close attention to both Australia and New Zealand, and interfere as it suits. When Trump was installed in office, he appointed a new US ambassador to Wellington, who actually made a point of intervening in the last election in 2017 that installed the current government in office, because they wanted a government that would be their lieutenant in the South Pacific. And so they ensured that happened. And so I have no doubt that the signal that was sent, in the debate the other night to Washington was very, very clearly earmarked. They were both presenting themselves as, reliable allies, and nothing
reliable
is said
partners
about that.
In crime to the American, I would say, Anglo-American empire, because the British Empire also did not end after 1945. It just completely restructured itself.
Well, New Zealand, of course, has always tied itself to one or other of the predominant imperialist powers. Since World War II, it's been the US, but before World War II, it was the British. And one of the key reasons for that is to provide a basis for New Zealand's own imperial sort of interests in the Pacific. At the beginning of World War I, for instance, New Zealand invaded Samoa, which was then held by the Germans. And it has interests in countries around the Pacific. And so there's always been this kind of quid pro quo between New Zealand and the prevailing imperialist power, whatever it may be. and currently, of course, it's the US. But the problem that it's presenting is that China is the country's main economic affiliate. So, there's been a balancing act for many years that every government has participated in, but increasingly it's untenable. Increasingly now, Washington is putting the screws on for both Australia and New Zealand to choose sides, and that's what's been happening over the last 3 years. But this is not up for discussion in the New Zealand election. It's just completely unreal. It's as if there has not been a single question on foreign policy in any of the debates. It's as if it's just off the radar. And that's quite deliberate.
That's actually that's interesting, Mr. Braddock, because you actually just answered question 6, which was, if we have time, explain New Zealand's real role in the world as a corporate dominated imperialist country, which is a partner in crime to the Anglo-American Empire and global plutocrats. But I think you already more or less just answer that question.
New Zealand, of course, is part of this Five Eyes spy network, that is sort of run by the US, but includes Australia and
Canada.
There's a spy base at the top of the North Island, at the top of the South Island, that's very secretive and that involves New Zealand in war preparations. Particularly with the build up against China. New Zealand is very much involved in that.
All righty.
As well as Iraq and Afghanistan, and successive governments have been involved in those wars and committed atrocities as well. New Zealand is not only an imperialist power, but actually one that has quite a brutal history. That's...
Also New Zealand, just like Australia, just like Canada, just like the United States, founded on the mass genocide and theft and subjugation of the Maori people, which we're definitely going to get into. But all right, but I think you both more or less kind of described the first question. So if either of you just want to comment again. So can you describe in an article you and the whole SCP group in New Zealand wrote several months ago before what was supposed to have been the general election planned for September. So can you describe in an article you wrote several months ago the ugly truth of the ruling Labour Party and the government of Jacinda Ardern, who surprisingly has been given positive coverage in even very left-leaning outlets like Telesur and her coalition, and talk also about her coalition partners. And can you briefly myth bust for us the terrible response to the coronavirus crisis of her and her coalition partners?
Well, I can start if you like. I mean, I think you're referring to our statement we published in February, which was summing up the record of the Ardern government. Which
fantastic article. I highly recommend people read it, and I'm going to post.
Yes. The right-wing record of Jacinda Ardern's government in New Zealand. At that point, this was before the pandemic had really emerged on a global scale. And already you could point out that the government had completely broken all of its promises, which was entirely predictable, by the way. They made in 20 to address poverty and inequality and homelessness and so on. I mean, what we went through in that article was really a number of things. I mean, firstly, what John has just spoken about in terms of how the government was formed, with following the public intervention by the US ambassador to because there was a period in 2017 of about 1 month almost where it wasn't clear who was going to be the government. The National Party.
Is that because it was just too close, too
right.
close, or
no, neither National nor the Labour Party had more than 50%. They went into talks with the New Zealand First Party, which was, which really decided who became the government. New Zealand First is only had about 7% of the votes, so it wasn't a huge party. It's not a popular party at all, but it does have its constituency.
It's led by Winston Peters, a biracial Maori politician, and is it safe to say that he's basically kind of like your Nigel Farage when he was leader of UKIP, or even worse, kind of like the Kiwi version of Pauline Hanson?
Yes, similar to both those people and to Trump in some ways. And in fact, his campaign for this election has got assistance from people who advised Nigel Farage in the Brexit referendum. So some of those same people are promoting New Zealand First as assisted Nigel Farage. They share basically the same nationalist politics, and New Zealand First, everyone knows, is a racist party. They are particularly racist against Asian immigrants and have been for years. They were founded in the early 90s as a sort of a breakaway from the National Party on the basis of anti-immigration, which was beginning to pick up then. And since then, they've been in government with both National and Labour. And so it was it was not entirely certain whether they would form a government with the National Party or the Labour Party in 2017. And all three parties, so both the major parties, were negotiating with them. And as we have analysed, and I think it's correct, the intervention of the United States was really critical in deciding what kind of government emerged. The National Party, which is a right-wing party, that had overseen austerity measures, had been in power since 2008, and is widely despised. But their only real difference with the Labour Party is over foreign policy. They are equally committed to the alliance with the United States, but they have tried to balance that with building a much stronger trading relationship with China, and that has exploded over the past decade or so.
Actually, Mr. Peters, can you explain again the minor difference, because there was a brief cut in the call?
Well, the differences shouldn't be exaggerated, but there's a significant division within the ruling class in New Zealand over those who, have backed the National Party, and in particular, support a much closer economic ties with China, basically, and have, it's not as though these people are against the alliance with the United States. Far from it. They entirely support that. They support the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, but they, like many governments throughout the Asia Pacific region, they've been caught in this dilemma where economically the country relies on China, but they have a long-standing military alliance with the US, and the US is not going to tolerate any wavering as it prepares for war against China. And so the Labour Party and New Zealand First, both of them, had positioned themselves for several years as basically the anti-China faction, agitating against immigrants and against Chinese-born MPs within the National Party and donors to the National Party from China. So they, they were the preferred option for Washington, for the Trump administration. And they made that very clear during this negotiation period publicly. The ambassador criticized the National Party and said, essentially, New Zealand needs to be more on board with our moves against China. And so after he made that intervention on television, the New Zealand First Party announced that it was going to form a coalition with Labour instead of National. So that's the whole origin of the government. And
so that's why so that's why Judith Collins was so anti Winston Peters at the last debate, when she was doing a one-on-one Q&A. Wow.
Yes, exactly. So because the National Party actually received more votes than Labour, and they expected to form a government in 2017 with New Zealand First, and they felt betrayed by that. But yes, I mean, so in other words, it's a right-wing government. It's a pro-imperialist government. It's a government that has aligned much more closely with the Trump administration. So everything that is said in the global media about how Ardern is supposedly, the antithesis to Donald Trump is
and they even say socialist. She's even described not just as progressive, but even socialist. And it's shocking how even left-leaning media and the most outspoken anti-imperialists on the internet have been propping up Ardern when they clearly do not know the history of not just her, but the Labour Party itself in New Zealand.
Well, that's the point is very important, because both in Australia and New Zealand, the Labour parties have played a critical role in propping up capitalism at every time. Every time there's been a crisis, and particularly when the working class starts to move against capitalism, the Labour parties have been brought forward to derail that. The first Labour government in New Zealand was installed in the middle of the Great Depression, and took New Zealand into the Second World War. It implemented some reformist policies in the same way that the US government did at the time,
like universal suffrage, the first pensions.
Well, in New Zealand as well, state housing and so on, really based on the fact that capitalism had two aims. One was to stave off 1917, a Russian Revolution, but also to buy off a layer of sort of trade union officials and so on, and as I say, to sort of settle down the crisis. Now, that has been repeated at critical junctures in both Australia and New Zealand, where the Labour Party has used this sort of presentation of being mildly socialist to derail the working class. Now, the issue is that in the 1980s, with the globalisation of production, the Labour parties could no longer afford to put forward reformist programs. I mean, the globalisation of production completely destroyed all reformist programs. So both in Australia and New Zealand in the 1980s, it was Labour governments that actually opened up the economy, destroyed the welfare state, laid waste to tens of thousands of jobs, and brought in what's called the neoliberal revolution. Yeah, and
you guys in New Zealand had David Lang, if I'm correct. He was
Longy and Douglas,
Australia had the ghastly Bob Hawke.
Yeah, that's right. And they
New
both
Labour,
did, you know,
New Labour before Tony Blair.
yeah, well, that's right. Well, they pursued here at this side of the world the same program that Thatcher imposed in Britain and Reagan imposed in the US, and it was completely anti-working class. It was intended to do the job of the international financial markets, and so what has happened is that any pretense that Labor has any sort of reforms left to offer is complete, you know, is just nonsense. And Ardern fits into that mold. Okay, I mean, despite the youth and the appeal to women and the, you know, she's had a baby and all of that sort of stuff, you know, she is the face of a reactionary Labor Party and a reactionary Labor government. She's the kind face, you know, and that the ruling elite needs a kind face at the moment because the lot of the New Zealand working class is actually dire. I mean, New Zealand workers have some of the lowest wages, you know, anywhere. I mean, there are tens of thousands of New Zealanders who go and try and eke out a living in Australia because wages are low, welfare benefits are low, you know, services are, you know, stretched to the limit. And so this is the system that they preside over. So this sort of myth of you know, the progressive, liberal, sort of even socialist New Zealand Labor government is just nonsense. And it's presented for this particular purpose of trying to, well, it has a domestic purpose, you know, to try and, you know, stop a rebellion in the New Zealand working class, which is not actually succeeding at the moment because we can talk about the strikes that have happened here in the last couple of years, but it also has an international purpose, you know, that to present to workers elsewhere that, well, you know, the Labor parties are not all as bad as Blair and all the rest of it, you know, and it's complete, you know, it's a false face.
Actually, and one second. Actually, funny. You guys are very good. You're always way ahead of the questions because the second question was, can you describe the history of the ultra-capitalist reactionary age, often described as neoliberalism? But I prefer that all of us, especially people at the World Socialist website, use this term, neo-Dickensian, how it took off in New Zealand and how the Labour Party of New Zealand, like the Labour Party of Bob Hawke and Keating, were... Well, anyways, you pretty much already answered that question. So, actually, yeah, actually talk then about how there has always been a working class rebellion even against the ruling Labor parties. So talk about our favorite subjects on this show and the topics you guys often cover, which is talk about the pseudo-left and the critical role the pseudo-left, especially the unions, have been in propping up the Labour Party and which is the rival oligarchic party of New Zealand.
Well, that's a big subject. I mean, I guess the history of the pseudo-left, which is the term we use to describe, you know, a broad number of tendencies, but ones that, in some way or other, at least historically, claimed to be socialist. In the case of New Zealand, they played a very critical role in the period of history that John has just described in the 1980s, in really diverting any direct struggle against this onslaught by the David Lange Labour government. You know, there was eventually, I mean, what happened was after tens of thousands of people had been made redundant with the full assistance of the trade union bureaucracy, and you know, industries were being prepared for privatization, like the railways and forestry and so on, and telecommunications. The whole economy was opened up subsidies for farmers were taken away and many were plunged into poverty. So all of that was happening with really no resistance. And the key role in that was played by the unions and their apologists and the Labour Party's apologists in, for example, the Pabloite group, which no longer exists, but was called the Socialist Action League. And there were, Maoist organizations as well, which have collapsed and no longer exist. But they, essentially were oriented towards the Labour Party. The Socialist Action League would encourage people to vote for Labour well into the late 1980s. And then finally, I believe in 1989, there was a split off from the Labour Party. After tens of thousands of workers had torn up their membership cards, and there was a rebellion that was kind of brewing in the working class. And in order to contain all of that, really, and to prevent it from actually taking a socialist form, a faction of the Labour Party's MPs split off and founded what was first called the New Labour Party and later became the Alliance Party, led by Jim Anderton. And, really its role was to, I guess, present a sort of, supposedly left alternative. But in the end, they just simply ended up re-entering Parliament and supporting the next Labour government, and that's been the role of the pseudo-left historically, and then more recently they all have completely endorsed Jacinda Ardern in 2017.
We're talking about we're talking about the Green Party as well, right?
Right. Well, the Green Party were part of the alliance, at least for a while, and then formed their own independent party. I guess, yeah, they've gone through various permutations. These sorts of, there's a whole range of parties: the New Labour Party, the Alliance, the Greens, and also the Maori nationalist Mana Party, which all sort of have many of the same people involved in them, they reform themselves all over and over again, each time to present a new parliamentary trap for the working class, basically.
So it's kind of like political gaslighting, more or less.
Well, they play a definite role in the political superstructure, in preventing any real challenge to the Labour Party, essentially, so yes.
Sorry, Tom. The alliance, in fact, the whole experience of the alliance is very instructive, because in a way they sort of prefigured the sort of role that Syriza played in Greece more recently. I mean, having split from the Labour Party, there was a whole turn in New Zealand. There was complete hostility to the two-party system, and so the German MNP system of proportional representation was brought in the early 90s to try and give Parliament, a bit of credibility. And so under those conditions, the alliance stood for elections. It got 15 to 18% of the vote, a number of MPs. But then in 2001, when Helen Clark was the leader of the Labour Party, Jim Anderton was, I think, the Deputy Prime Minister. The year, 9/11 happened, and Washington sent out the call to, its allies to help invade Afghanistan. So New Zealand, the Labour government, with the support of the alliance, voted to send SAS troops into Afghanistan. And so that completely exposed, the politics behind the alliance, that they were, not only pro-Labor, but pro-imperialist war or outfit. They collapsed and broke apart very soon afterwards because of this. But, they played an objective role. Now, as Tom has said, since then, a whole lot of the figures, who are involved in this went into other parties, into politics, into the unions, have actually explained to the working class anything about their role at this time. They just move on to the next betrayal, and as if it never happened. And it's just, it's a complete picture.
I remember interviewing Chris Marsden, and when we talked about the history of epic betrayals that even people like Jeremy Corbyn have done, and my response when Chris was explaining the history of Trotskyism and the history of the pseudo-left in Britain, my response was, wow, with friends like these, who needs enemies?
Yeah, and what they do is they play a critical role in today in presenting the persona that you have already mentioned about Ardern and Labor being the progressive alternative. At one stage the argument in New Zealand politics was that Labor was the lesser evil. That you had to support Labor, a bit like, Biden, it's the lesser evil.
Yeah.
But now they don't even claim that Labor is the lesser evil. They claim that Labor is a progressive party that can be pushed to the left. And that's their current position in these elections. They will admit, that, Ardern stood in the last elections claiming that that they would do away with child poverty. They even used the sort of claimed that capitalism had needed to have a kinder face and all this sort of thing. And the pseudo-lefts now say, well, that those transformational policies didn't happen, but next time they will. And that's the continual fraud that's put before the New Zealand working class.
And actually, before we get into the plight of the Maori people and the Maori Misleadership class and the Maori pseudo-left, because we didn't talk about the coronavirus crisis and the response to it. Now, I've talked 2 or 3 times about the coronavirus crisis, and I've expressed my deep anger that you have this highly infectious disease. I'm not going to get into all of those people who say that hospital masks are akin to, the government pointing a gun to your head. I don't want to get into that argument, but you have this highly infectious disease in which people need to stay at home, and people need to not be not be in school, not be in work, and so forth. And these capitalist governments and their social democratic apologists need to get their shit together and actually fight this disease. And so you need a temporary confinement, lockdown, and so forth. But Miss Ardern, Miss so-called progressive that Jeremy Corbyn, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and even Miriam Haddad of the Green Party of Canada have all been praising Ardern. But what kind of a person knows that there's this highly infectious disease and says to people with her union backers, go to work, go to school. If you get infected, tough shit, at least we have universal health care to protect you.
Yes, I guess
your response to that, as well as the fact that there have been teacher unions and hospitals who have been protesting this, but the union leadership has said to them, shut up, go back to work, go back to school, right?
Right. I mean, it is, of course, it is the case that there are only, I think, 25 deaths in New Zealand, which obviously the virus has not taken hold here the way it has in many countries. Now, our position, our argument, though, is that it's entirely false to kind of give Jacinda Ardern or the government the credit for that. I mean, the fact is there was definite resistance to locking down the country from the government and from the unions, as you mentioned. But there was also a great fear of the working class taking its own action. That is why a lockdown was imposed in late March, because there was a groundswell led by thousands of doctors and healthcare practitioners, but there was I think at least two major online petitions which gained well over 100,000 signatures within just a few days, demanding a lockdown. And the government was facing I mean, this was basically threatening to get out of control. And the nurses' union was unable to control it. They denounced these petitions, but the government was basically forced to take this action. And then, as we've also drawn attention to on the site, whenever they eased restrictions, it was always much too early, and as a result of that, there was a second outbreak in August, which was discovered in August anyway, which caused at least 2 more deaths. So so there's never been enough testing. Nothing has been done to really strengthen the capacity of the healthcare system. Should there be a major outbreak, the hospitals will still be completely unable to cope with it. And the country is at risk. I mean, there's an epidemiologist who was on the radio the other day, Michael Baker, who pointed out that in the hotel quarantine facilities for returned travelers, there's a significant number of those who may have the virus. And there's been a breach of those facilities on average about once every 2 weeks. So those could lead to a new outbreak. Obviously it's true that New Zealand is not in the dire circumstances of other countries, but that's through a combination of luck, New Zealand being in a relatively isolated place, and also the action or the determination of the working class, really, not to allow that to happen. So that's our basic analysis, and it would be very wrong to be complacent about that.
And Mr. Bragg, before we get into police brutality, the plight of the Maoris, and the Maori Misleadership, anything else you want to add? Because you did mention how there's always been workers ready to strike and give the system a good kick up the backside, but then the pseudo-left, the union misleadership class, the controlled opposition finds a way to always stop it.
Well, in fact, during the term of this government, there have been historically large strikes by teachers and nurses in particular in 2018. In particular, the nurses' strikes were carried out against the wishes of the union leadership, and they were strikes carried out against the economic and fiscal policies of the government that were responsible for running down both health and education. So they were warning flags, really, and I think since 2018 there's been a particular nervousness in the ruling elite about the eruption of workers' struggles. I mean, the case of the nurses, this was the first nationwide strike in over 20 years. In the case of the teachers, it was the first combined strike of secondary teachers and primary teachers for decades. I mean, they are organised in separate unions, but on this occasion there was a joint strike, and so there was a real it reflected the sort of uprising of workers' struggles happening internationally. And certainly that was reflected in New Zealand, and I think it's
and independent from even from even the pseudo-left, like the Greens and so forth, saying, "Oh, we stand with these striking." Like they've been actually doing this, basically saying, "To hell with you guys, we're striking because we cannot tolerate this system," right?
Well, certainly in the case of the union, the nurses, as I say, the nurses' union has been thrown into complete crisis over this, and I mean, there are we had some involvement speaking to work nurses set up their own website, and we were having discussions with them. There was a certain desire to find a new and better union. They were saying, well, surely there must be a better union. And our position, was, well, no, you have to break from the unions and build rank and file committees and take these struggles into your own hands. That, of course, is a big step for workers to take. But there is now a very significant section of the working class who are completely disillusioned with unions. They don't see them as presenting any way of protecting their interests, and who are looking for an alternative. And as I say, the perspective we're putting forward, and you'll be aware that this is a perspective that we put forward internationally, is for workers to break away from the unions and to form, their own independent committees controlled by themselves, and we put forward that platform in every place where we have active sections.
And yes, and again, they should be joining the Socialist Equality Group of New Zealand. And absolutely. I think that's a great segue then to this question. And the next couple of questions is basically, I really want to talk about the plight of the Maori people. So, okay, here it goes. So in New Zealand, after the state murder of George Floyd sparked nationwide protests and globally around the world solidarity protests, in which New Zealand was one of the countries where that was happening, I believe, unless I'm wrong, many took the chance to highlight institutional racism towards the Maori people, immigrant communities, and others at the hands of the states and the police in New Zealand. Can you talk about the policies of mass incarceration, the prison industrial complex, and police brutality in New Zealand, and how it compares to the ongoing situation in the US, Canada, and Australia, and to a certain extent Britain and France when it comes to its indigenous people and its immigrant communities?
Yes, I mean, I have a couple of notes on this. I mean, it's true that the murder of George Floyd did spark protests here, as it did internationally, and those also, drew attention to police brutality, violence, and racism in New Zealand. I mean, regarding, I guess the first point to make is it is in the media presented as an issue of, purely of racism. Undoubtedly, that plays a role, but the key issue really is class. That's the key reason, I guess, that Maori are overrepresented, vastly overrepresented in the statistics, because they are, a particularly oppressed section of the working class. I mean, for example, Maori in the prison system make up about half of the prison population, despite only being 15% of New Zealand's population. There's also statistics showing Maori are 7.6 times more likely than white New Zealanders, Pākehā, to be on the receiving end of police force, whether that's firearms or other types of force. So, those are very stark statistics, and it is because of the historical oppression of Maori, but it is primarily a class question, and our, I guess, emphasis in all of our articles is on that, because the strategy that the working class must adopt to deal with these issues is the strategy of uniting workers across racial boundaries. And I mean, the idea is put forward by the Ardern government, as it is in the United States by the Democrats, that you can solve these problems if you just appoint more Maori police officers, more, Maori prison officers, more, etc., all throughout the state services.
Yeah.
Which is, that's been the kind of response of the ruling elite for decades, and it's been a complete, an ongoing disaster for the vast majority of Maori, who are, as I say, haven't improved their living standards at all, and still definitely suffer from various forms of racism. But there has been a policy, I guess, going back to the Longi government and even before then, to sort of cultivate an elite layer and to suggest that Maori capitalism is really the answer of these social problems. More Maori entrepreneurs can be created, and that's been done through a complicated process known as the Treaty of Waitangi, which has awarded massive state handouts to numerous tribes in order to basically set up business operations, hundreds of millions of dollars. So there's now a whole very large industry which has been supported by the National Party governments and Labour Party governments, with direct handouts. So in the fishing industry, the forestry industry, tourism, etc. A very small layer of Maori have become very wealthy, while nothing has improved at all for the vast majority. So there's a huge class divide basically among Maori now, and the politics of identity has completely failed. So yes, I think that answers perhaps your question.
Yeah, well, I think that's a perfect segue then to this question, which is can you? By the way, very interesting, because because now Native Americans have the worst. I mean, they suffered the worst when it comes to the capitalist caste system that we have in America. Same with Canada. And I don't even have to talk to you guys about Australia, where the Aboriginals really suffer horrendously. But New Zealand, it sounds to me as if the New Zealand elites have decided, okay, we're going to treat our indigenous people the way America has treated its Latino and Black people, which is trying to introduce them Maori capitalism and so forth, right?
Well, it's been a deliberate policy because in the period of the early 1970s, when there was internationally a real sort of upsurge of working class struggles, the Maori working class were very militant. They were Maori workers were in some of the bigger industries in New Zealand, the meat works, the railways, and so on. And they were the most militant sections of the working class. So when the big struggles in the early 70s erupted, there was a deliberate policy put forward to try and divert this into a sort of a separate sort of, Maori-only issues. And so the whole question of land rights was sort of brought forward. That the way for Maori workers was not to be part of a militant working class, but to claim tribally based land rights and so on. And so the whole, a whole sort of land rights process was set up and put into action. And it was really accelerated under the Longy-Douglas government that we've spoken about in the 1980s, when Longy and Douglas laid waste to many of these industries. I mean, they destroyed the railway, the state railway system, sold it off. Thousands and thousands of Maori workers were put into unemployment, into mass poverty. And that's when the Longy-Douglas government accelerated this whole issue of the sort of Treaty of Waitangi settlements, that the tribes could bid for or go through a process of claiming millions of dollars, ostensibly in recompense for land that was taken from them in the 19th century. But as Tom said, basically it had two purposes. One was to set up this pro-capitalist layer at the top, a privileged layer, but also to drive a wedge between the interests of Maori workers.
I was just thinking. It sounds like a classic divide and conquer thing that the New Zealand white elites, under the auspices of reconciliation and justice for Maori, but really this is just another clever divide and conquer tool that they just used.
Yeah. Well, and it has become. It's become ingrained in everyday life, in New Zealand in all sorts of ways. I mean, the Maori language was given the status of an official language. And so, visitors who now come to New Zealand will be, will see signs in Maori and English and so on. The business of handing out millions of dollars to tribes has had the effect of children who go to school, when they learn to introduce themselves, start by saying which tribe, their lineage goes back to, and sometimes it's more than one tribe. So they will stand up and say, my lineage goes back to tribe A and tribe B and so on. So there's a whole sort of life process, if you like, built around not just ethnic affiliation, but tribal affiliation. It's sort of it's boiled down to very specific affiliation, because money is connected to it. And there have been, even now, I mean, there are most of the settlements have gone through and have resulted in millions of dollars in payouts to this tribe and that tribe. But there have been, even today, there's sort of strife between different sections of the same tribe over these questions. So it's absolutely divisive. It's absolutely reactionary, and it's being wheeled forward at precisely time where the working class needs a united strategy. And not one based on sort of this privilege or that privilege, which is being, endorsed and promoted. I mean, as Tom suggested, the figures about inequality show that inequality within the Maori community is worse than inequality in society at large, because of the way the settlement money has actually benefited a very thin layer at the top.
So it sounds to me, Mr. Braddock and Mr. Pierce, you can also comment on this before we talk specifically about the Maori Party. But it sounds to me as if the model, because New Zealand, again, is touted as the model for how Australia, Canada, the Nordic countries with the Sami people, and the US, how they should finally put an end to white supremacy and colonization, and finally have reconciliation and give land rights to Native Americans, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islanders, First Nations, Inuit, Métis, Hawaiians, and so forth. But it sounds to me as if any of those countries actually used the New Zealand model, that it's just going to be a further divide and conquering where, yeah, of those marginalized indigenous groups, right?
Yes, that's exactly right, and that's why it is put forward as a model by the, I guess, corresponding elite layers in those different indigenous populations. It's got nothing to do with advancing the social position of the masses of indigenous people who are certainly extremely impoverished, and everything to do with integrating the top layers into capitalism. And yes, I can see in New Zealand some people have made a lot of money, basically, but it's hardly it's not the Maori population as a whole. I guess could say a few things about the Maori Party, which is the main.
Yeah. So that's a good segue, which is now. I've had Margaret Kimberly on my show several times, and we often talk about what Black Agenda Report calls the Black Misleadership class, which are these people who claim to be for, helping out, Black people, and that they're the spokesperson of, the Black population, but really they're just a bunch of capitalists, pseudo-leftists, controlled opposition, and just sheep herding, the Black working class into the Democrats. And there is that happening in Australia with the Aboriginal people. So talk about the, what I would call the Maori Misleadership class, and why, if I was a Maori person, why I actually should not be supporting the Maori Party.
Right. Well, as a matter of fact, I mean, the Maori Party has only existed for a relatively short time. They came into being during the early 2000s as a split off from the Labour Party, basically on the basis that the Labour Party was not doing enough in terms of the treaty settlements for the various tribal elites. Then what happened when the National Party came to power in 2008, I believe it was at that time, the Maori Party joined them in the government. They supported the National Party and took positions as ministers in that government. So they were part of a right-wing government, and which carried out all of the austerity measures in response to the 2008 global financial crash, including further privatizations and mass redundancies, and an increase in the GST consumption tax that harmed the working class. And in return for supporting all of that, the national government really ramped up the number of treaty settlements for the Maori elite. So during that whole period after the 2008 crisis, inequality widened significantly within the population as a whole, and within Maoridom as well. And the Maori Party became very despised among the Maori working class. There was, they are basically seen as traitors by many people, and for good reason. It's extremely instructive about where identity politics basically leads. The politics based on race rather than class. It has so anyway, in the last election, the Maori Party failed to win any seats in Parliament. They're now trying to get back in and trying to kind of portray themselves as being somehow more progressive. But if you look at their policies, everything is based on the idea that the solution to the urgent problems facing Maori is to set up a kind of parallel system, which, for example, there's a massive housing crisis in New Zealand. There's, homelessness has skyrocketed, and the Labour government promised to do something about it, and it's done absolutely nothing. So the solution presented by the Maori Party is, well, we've got to set aside 50% of all state housing for Maori on the basis of race. So that's their attitude to healthcare as well. You need a separate Maori health system which controls 1/5 of the health budget, and so on. A separate Maori social services, and the aim is twofold. You have on the one hand a whole upper middle class layer which would benefit from running these separate systems, and on the other hand, the aim is to pit Maori workers against white workers, against immigrants, and to divide up the working class on that basis. It's an extremely right-wing program, basically, that they are presenting, and has as I said, I don't think has a lot of support among the Maori working class because of the record of what they've delivered, which is massive inequality.
And Mr. Braddock, continuing on with what Mr. Peters was saying, which is shocking, but yeah, I remember watching a documentary about the neo-Dickensian neoliberal age of New Zealand, and I was kind of dozing off while watching the documentary, but then the documentary mentioned that the Maori Party supported the National Party, and I was like, what? I mean, that would kind of be like a black nationalist party led by Malcolm X supporting, Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan. Like, that's how, out of whack that is. And
that's right.
Yeah, but the question I wanted to ask was Maori are a marginalized group, but I guess it's a 5-star hotel for them compared to the Aboriginal people of Australia, First Nations in Canada, and the Native Americans, and even the Sami people. But are the Maori Party or the Mana Party, do they actually support imperialism overseas, colonialism overseas, but saying that they want self-determination and good civil rights for Maori people, but when it comes to imperialism overseas, they either support it or don't say anything about it?
Well, interesting, because in the last couple of years, there's been celebrations in Australia and New Zealand over, the conclusion of World War I and so on. And one of the things that the Maori elite have used that for is to celebrate what was called the Maori Battalion. The Maori Battalion was, a dedicated Maori group within the armed forces that went overseas to fight in an imperialist war, and this history is glorified and promoted as something that should be upheld regardless of the aims of the imperialist venture. I was going to go on and talk a bit more about the Maori Party, because there was a breakaway a so-called left-wing breakaway from the Maori Party at the point where the Maori Party became so on the nose as far as the Maori working class was concerned. There was one of their MPs by the name of Hone Harawira broke away and set up what was called the Mana Party. Now, so Harawira was an MP for one of the most impoverished sections, geographic sections in Northland, and basically did nothing to improve the lot of the people there. But he postured as a left winger, and when he set up the Mana Party, the pseudo-left identities that we've been discussing all flocked in to support and campaign for the Mana Party, including the entire ISO in New Zealand, all sort of were members of two parties. They were members of the ISO and the Mana Party, and campaigned for them. Well, the Mana Party, adopted a whole series of quite reactionary policies. One of them was that, their policy on unemployment was that New Zealand workers, should be employed first. It was an anti-immigrant policy, basically, jobs for New Zealand workers first. But then they also became one of the leading groups to take up the anti-China campaign. Their position really is that, any Chinese immigrants were going to be a threat to the interests of Maori in New Zealand. So they took up the anti-China campaign. At one point, Harawira blamed these people for the drug trade, claiming that the Chinese interests were responsible. It's like Trump blaming China for the coronavirus. The Chinese interests were to blame for
and Trump often says that China has stolen our jobs. It's like, no, it hasn't. It's businesses going to China for cheap labor.
Well, Harawira then raised the question that these Chinese people should receive capital punishment. This is a sort of completely reactionary, anti-immigrant, anti-China campaign that fits in, very well with the whole kind of preparation for war against China. So it was the Maori Party lining up with the Greens were part of it, the Labour Party were part of it, and New Zealand First. There was this sort of cross-party campaign that has put New Zealand on the front line, if you like, with Australia in the Pacific against China. So in terms of a party that supports imperialism, yes, absolutely. Now, interestingly, the Mana Party has, was sort of all but wiped out at the last election as well. And now they've rejoined the Maori Party for this election. So having walked out on them, a few years back, they're now back in the fold. So it's completely unprincipled.
Wow. So you have that in New Zealand. So you have this country which is seen as the model for a white supremacist country finally lifting up their impoverished indigenous people. But it just sounds to me as if as if not only the land rights, which is used as a model, has divided and conquered the Maori people itself, but now because everybody uses Maori culture, as a front for let's celebrate World War I, let's celebrate World War II. If you guys want equal rights, go kill a bunch of Iraqis, go kill a bunch of Vietnamese, and it just sounds to me as if New Zealand should not at all be the model for how First Nations and Canada and Australia and America should emulate if they want to finally dismantle the legacy and the ongoing colonial project that they live under, right?
Well, to go back to the start, it's all of these are class questions. Our perspective is to mobilise the working class across all races, across all nationalities, across national borders, on the basis of the struggle for socialism, not on the struggle for some sort of separate Maori. The Maori Party is standing in these elections calling for a separate Maori parliament. I mean, this is just, insanely reactionary politics being brought forward right at the point where the working
And
class...
separate parliaments haven't done anything to help advance their people. In the U.S., it's not done anything to help out Native Americans. In Canada, nothing. And the Sami people, yeah, it's just basically a talk shop, more or less, and then hoping that whatever, racist goon is in power or capitalist goon is in power says, here's your $100, have fun trying to, buy a house and whatnot, right?
Yeah.
And it's the Mr. Pierce?
Well, just that it is part of an international trend, really. I mean, one parallel that comes to mind is South Africa, for example, with the end of apartheid and the promotion of what was called black capitalism. And now, the situation there is just one of extreme inequality and brutality towards the vast impoverished working class, while you have a tiny layer of very wealthy people in the ANC. I mean,
the Black Misleadership class.
Right, but if anything, that's the international model, including for the Maori elites in New Zealand. It's not exactly the same, but what we're seeing is the complete dead end historically of any sort of program based on nationalism, national identity, to improve the lot of the working class. And as John said, the only alternative is through the fight to unify workers internationally on the basis of socialism, complete opposition to capitalism, rather than trying to find some sort of niche within the system. I think we may have to wrap up. Sorry.
Alrighty. Well, actually, that's probably a pretty good place to wrap up, and that's why I think you two have made the case why the Maori and all of the working class should be joining the SEP, along with First Nations people and people of Canada, Australia, the US, and so forth. But before we conclude. I have to ask this question because we are doing a lot of truth telling and myth busting on New Zealand. Let's not talk about the educational system, but the healthcare system in New Zealand, is it very much quasi privatized like the NHS? I ask this because John Pilger, who praises the work of the World Socialist website and the SCP, he recently did a documentary, his second documentary on the NHS, about how the NHS has been effectively privatized, hence why the coronavirus in Britain has been so severe. And is that also the same situation in New Zealand when we talk about the healthcare system in New Zealand?
Well, I think there are many parallels. I mean, it is supposedly a public universal system, but the reality is there is a growing private system alongside that, and that is certainly being used to undermine the public system. Increasingly, people can't get access to treatment. There are eternal waiting lists for people with severe, conditions like cancer, and there have been many cases of people dying on the waiting list. So that's right. I mean, that's why there has been such an upsurge of not only nurses but doctors who have held nationwide strikes, and midwives, and basically every subsection of the health workforce has been on strike over the past 2 years, including ambulance, paramedics, and the response is always that we just don't have enough money to deal with it. As we pointed out recently, they have tens of billions of dollars to give to businesses and to the banks to prop them up during this pandemic, and a tiny fraction of that for the health system. So, yeah, I think there probably are many similarities with Britain.
Yeah, there is definitely a two-tier health system. There is the public system, as Tom said, that's underfunded. There's just been a crisis at the Christchurch Hospital that's received a $180 million top up from the government just to keep going, basically. But there are also, the people who can afford it get private health insurance. They can get into private hospitals. The private hospitals are
which are state subsidized on top of that.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Private hospitals, invariably have better equipment, sort of better staff ratios, and so on. And meanwhile, the public hospital system has just been underfunded for years, and is deteriorating. Certainly, if there was a bigger outbreak of COVID-19 in New Zealand, the health system it's been proven could not cope. So yeah, it's
one very last thing, and you guys can be however brief you want to be about it. The Christchurch shooter, this racist, this racist goon who shot up, who shot up a mosque. Chris Graham of New Matilda, one of the only left news outlets in Australia, was talking about how Australian racism and the racism towards Aboriginal people is very much linked to what happened in New Zealand. But you guys took a very, very different take on that and actually said that no, you can blame Australian racism, but New Zealand has a lot of homegrown white supremacist fascist movements. So however brief you want to be, can you actually talk about that?
Sure. Well, certainly both countries produced this atrocity, and the response of Winston Peters, for example, the New Zealand First Leader, was to say, this guy's got nothing to do with New Zealand, almost as though this was an attack by Australia on New Zealand. But the reality is, his party in particular, has been demonizing Muslims for years, and saying things in his speeches about New Zealanders being replaced by Muslims, which is exactly the same sort of rhetoric that you can find in Brenton Tarrant's manifesto. Which is why, by the way, the manifesto is banned in New Zealand, so that nobody can see those glaring parallels between his, ravings and the racism and xenophobia that's been promoted by, really, in one way or another, by every party,
including unions, you said as well.
Right. Well, in terms of their anti-immigrant stance, yes, and. So, it's not simply obviously he is a product of Australia, and Australia has this long history of racist demagogues, the Pauline Hansons and so on. He's also a product of the United States. His idol was Donald Trump, and the election of Donald Trump was clearly a political milestone for this terrorist. So, he's a product of decaying capitalism internationally. And New Zealand is in no way separate from that. Yes, the Labour government is entirely complicit. They have participated in these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the demonization of Muslim immigrants as well. The state has completely, as we've written about, turned a blind eye to all of the growth of neo-Nazi groups, both in Australia and New Zealand. Despite, there were many warnings that something like this would happen. It didn't, it was not, obviously this
act of violence, not a spontaneous act of violence.
Right. And I mean, obviously the scale of it is particularly shocking. But nevertheless, it's not as though there was nobody predicting that something like this could happen. There were numerous warnings to the government and the state agencies that were just totally dismissed or downplayed. And there are so many questions about how this attack happened. There's no transparency from the government's inquiry into it. It's all being held completely in secret. I mean, how did he manage to train in New Zealand for 2 years while also traveling the world, going to places like Pakistan and North Korea and all over the place, and somehow meeting various white supremacist groups in Europe, donating to them? This all was allowed to happen somehow, and there's a lot of questions about it.
Ms. Braddock, want to add anything more to that? Actually,
well, only to point out that since the massacre, the Ardern government has used it to start introducing all sorts of anti-democratic laws, and in particular to lead the way in calls for internet censorship. She went to Paris and sat down alongside, European leaders and launched what was called the Christchurch Call, demanding, very wide powers to censor the internet. So, the outcome of this has been a turn to the right, really, and an attack on democratic rights that's, now bearing fruit.
Strengthening the Kiwi deep state, which is a partner in crime to the Five Eyes Alliance. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All righty. Well, on that note, yes, it's a pretty bleak note to end on.
Yes, but we are not devoid of hope at all. We are.
Yes, that's what. Yes, I was just about to say. Again, that's why people should be joining the SEP and voting en masse for the Socialist Equality Party in New Zealand. And I still think, even though I'm going to get a lot of hate mail and a lot of flack, same in the people should be voting for the SEP in the US.
The first thing we have to do is build a party here. Because at the moment we aren't a party, but yes, and I'd encourage people to find us on Facebook. We have a Facebook page, and you can contact us through there, or email us as well at Socialist Equality.
I'll make sure to do that. Yeah.
So it's been very good talking to you. But yes, we anticipate there will be a massive resurgence of class struggle in New Zealand. I mean, how could there not be? People's, I think 1/3 of households have reported a decline in their income over the past year, and the median wage has dropped almost 8%. So poverty levels are soaring, and people are, not going to be content with the platitudes that Ardern is offering, and they will come into conflict, as they already have in the past 2 years. I mean, but that's just an anticipation, really.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we were joined on this very special edition of 1+1, all things New Zealand, all New Zealand edition. Thomas, John, thank you both so much for joining me. I'm really looking forward to uploading this, and I hope that this will be the first of many conversations between the three of us on all things New Zealand, so that people in Australia and Canada and the US don't look with rose-tinted glasses that everything's all hunky-dory in New Zealand. We need to be more like them. No, they need to know that the issues they face are as dire in New Zealand, which is why the working class needs to why the working class needs to unite, and why people need to join SEP branches and strengthen a real people power party and movement.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Youri.
Thanks so much for joining me, and looking forward to the future of more conversations.
Bye-bye.
Right.